Hello and welcome to the European Dialogue. Today's episode takes us to the heart of one of the greatest, most ambitious, and I should really say evolving policy experiments right now, the European Green Deal. And I'm delighted to be joined by Professor Radu Mares, who's doing critical research on this policy. Radu is an associate professor at the Raoul Wallenberg Institute of Human Rights at Lund University. And I had the pleasure of meeting him earlier this month at the EU Values International Conference in Istanbul, where we connected over his excellent presentation on the Green Deal and what he calls a potential regulatory revolution. Now, this paper, titled "Is the EU Green Deal a Regulatory Revolution?", is still a work in progress, so it's a real treat to be able to share with you some exclusive insights on Radu's ongoing research. In our conversation, we unpack what the European Green Deal actually is and explore Radu's concept of the layered smart mix, a helpful way to understand the EU's evolving approach to regulating global supply chains. We also get into the unintended consequences of this ambitious agenda, things like leakage and pushback, especially from countries outside the EU, and how the bloc might better balance climate leadership with global fairness. So, without further ado, let's get into it. Welcome to the podcast, Radu. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Emily.
So to start us off, what is the European Green Deal? And why do you describe it as potentially launching a regulatory revolution in your paper?
So the EU Green Deal is the European Union's commitment to a climate-neutral economy by 2050. It's a framework for the green and just transition. And the EU aims to transform its economy to be an inclusive and green economy. It's a very detailed blueprint containing many different types of instruments, both facilitative and directive instruments. They target the real economy as well as finance. And of course, the emphasis is on the environmental side, especially climate, but also biodiversity and pollution. And most interesting on the social side, there is commitments to human rights protection and lots of instruments on corporate accountability and human rights due diligence and social reporting. So it's a very, very complex and ambitious document. And maybe it's daring to call it a regulatory revolution because right now it's under revision. As we all know, the ambitions are being recalibrated because of security and competitiveness reasons, as the Commission explains. But I think it can be seen as an ambitious experiment between 2020, when the Green Deal was adopted, until 2025, because in just 5 years, things have moved very fast. It's a very comprehensive, a big number of documents, numerous due diligence, corporate due diligence instruments that are unprecedented globally. So actually with this Green Deal and all these corporate accountability instruments, the EU emerged as the global leader in turning soft law instruments like the UN Guiding Principles into hard law, into enforceable obligations. And it can be revolutionary because of the way that these instruments complement each other, and they constitute a regulatory ecosystem, and some people would call it maybe a smart mix as measures as anticipated in the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights.
Yeah, you mentioned the smart mix, which refers to the combination of policy initiatives to achieve the EU's climate goals. And in your conference paper specifically, you introduced this idea of the layered smart mix. Perhaps for our audience, for our listeners, could you explain how does it help us understand the EU's approach to regulating supply chains?
Yeah. So the layered smart mix may be a quirky term that refers to the smart mix, which is an established term in regulatory governance. So the layered smart mix, it's a broadening of this older concept in order to account for new developments and how they relate to each other. The smart mix idea emerged in the 90s in regulatory theory as a response to the limitations of command and control, very stringent regulation. And it was a new way for governments to regulate and steer the economy. John Ruggie, when he proposed the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, very much promoted this smart mix thinking as a way to advance his norm of human rights due diligence. So this reshaped the business and human rights discourse starting with 2011, and this smart mix thinking opened the eyes of states, if you want, to the variety of regulatory tools that they have, that they should employ, they should combine in an intelligent mix. So this is quite important in the current context because as we moved away from the hyper-globalization period, we have seen the return of the state, and the EU is a prime example of the regulators being ready to move beyond corporate voluntarism and starting to regulate, maybe light touch, maybe more stringent regulations. And I think what is interesting from a smart mix perspective is that the EU Green Deal regulatory ecosystem really creates hybrid forms of transnational economic governance where public authority and private authority are combined in hybrid forms and then affect the governance of global value chains. So the layered smart mix try to account for these hybrid forms of regulation, which is more forceful than we have seen before, but also the type of risks and the complexities that it can create as an extraterritorial form of regulation.
Yeah. Just then you mentioned the risks, and I know in your paper you also speak to risks of leakage and pushback in response to EU regulations. Could you explain what these terms mean and why they matter, and especially for countries outside of the EU?
Yeah, sure. I mean, this type of regulations that I'm focusing on, especially mandatory due diligence laws and corporate reporting, are quite controversial, not only in the global north and with companies that have to comply with them, but they raise controversies also in affected countries, exporting countries, with governments from the global south, with stakeholders there. And I try to explain this type of concerns, which are very diverse, and kind of simplify them and say, this type of due diligence laws from Europe create two risks, and these are the risk of leakage and risk of pushback. Leakage is a well-known term in environmental governance. It has to do with the displacement created by laws, basically. There are unproductive or negative effects, unintended effects that make the achievement of the policy goals very difficult to achieve. So leakage is a form of displacement, and I would identify maybe three forms. I mean, displacement of production as companies redirect their supply chains maybe to other countries or maybe to other suppliers in the same country. So it's the displacement of production because of compliance with the laws. Then it's also another type of leakage, I would say, shifting the burden as brands, as the large companies have to comply with these laws. There is the risk that they will transfer the burden to their suppliers that have to document their sustainability performance, but also make the improvements, which can be costly, and typically they are not compensated for that. So that results in poverty, income, and very low wages. So that's another type of leakage. And the third type of leakage, I would say, is displacement of the authority to govern, because, for example, Brazil objected very much to the EU deforestation regulation and saw it as an interference in its policy space in making the difficult decisions and trade-offs to balance environmental protection and economic development and other issues. So this leakage in terms of the authority to govern being questioned and maybe moving outside the country, maybe moving to the private sector, that creates risk and complexity. So this is what what I mentioned by leakage in terms of this type of displacement, unintended quite often, and shifts that can be very problematic. And that brings me to pushback, because this type of risk of leakage generate resistance and all kinds of objections and concerns that states have voiced, for example, in the World Trade Organization, they raised both economic concerns but also political ones, because it's about state sovereignty and the consent of effective states, which doesn't exist by definition with these due diligence laws that are unilateral trade instruments. And if you have pushback, then the implementation of these due diligence laws by the companies as well as by the European states becomes very difficult. So the whole effectiveness and implementation becomes very problematic. So long story short, I think it's important to frame this type of risks created by Green Deal regulations and recognize the complexities and the dilemmas that are involved here, and then tackle them.
So what is the EU doing to prevent or reduce the risk of leakage? You just said it could be an unintended consequence, but unattended or otherwise, I mean, what is the EU doing to mitigate that risk?
It's a good question, because the EU actually recognizes the risk of leakage in the impact assessment of the deforestation regulation. There is a discussion about leakage of production, and the EU also adopts so-called legitimacy enhancing measures. If you look at the due diligence directive, for example, so there are lots of protective and supportive provisions in this draft directive that address directly this risk of burden shifting towards suppliers and what can be done in order to alleviate these concerns, which are fully justified. Now, how exactly and to what extent this risk of leakage and pushback can be mitigated is an open question. I mean, there are really complex issues, and they're extremely contextual as well. So each country affected is different. So this is what makes the discussion beautiful and very complex, and I would say important to figure out, because otherwise the legitimacy of this Green Deal regulations is in question, their implementation will be shortcut, and the final protective effects on human rights will not happen despite the stated ambition. So I would say everything is at stake there.
There has been some criticism that the EU is placing too much regulatory burden on producers in the global south. You've touched a bit on that today already. Could you tell us how your conference paper suggests how we can deal with these concerns?
Sure. I mean, it's this idea of the smart mix, revisiting this respectable concept, but trying to improve on it in light of these risks that I have just mentioned. I would say that in terms of a conceptual framing of these issues, I mean, we have to start with the problems and to foreground these two types of risks that are on the mind of stakeholders in the global south. Then I think we also need to foreground issues of legitimacy and effectiveness and legality of these unilateral trade instruments that the EU has adopted under the Green Deal. And then really not shy away, but actually center in our analysis all these complexities that I have mentioned that happen in the global south, and all the issues of trade-offs and dilemmas and paradoxes and unintended consequences when regulators in the global north finally try to hold corporations accountable. And I would say this can be slightly different from the smart mix concept itself. When you read the literature, the scholarship on smart mixes, you see a recurrent theme. It's basically that the concept it's under conceptualized what the smart mix means, but it's also high on rhetoric. I mean, smart mix, it's a connotation, so it has many virtues, but it's empirical. It's unclear whether this smart mix is actually deliver on their promise, whether they actually are a superior regulatory alternative to command and control or very prescriptive regulations. So I would say the layered smart mix that I work around not only centers the risks but accounts for what is happening now in some literature is this empirical turn in the study of due diligence regulations, is this more grounded analysis in terms of the impacts in the global south. And it's also an attempt to move beyond the rhetoric, because the rhetoric of the smart mix is against the wishes of the scholars that conceived it. It can work in a deregulatory manner, so it can inhibit the adoption of stringent corporate accountability laws. So I think one of the main findings of my research on these layered smart mixes would be that there is no incompatibility between smart mix thinking and stringent command and control regulations. Once you expand this smart mix to understand that these stringent regulations are part of a regulatory system, ecosystem that contains the real economy and finance and all kinds of different instruments, but we still need strong corporate accountability instruments, both on the corporate, on the demand side, but also impacts on the ground, on the supply side. So I think this is the heart of this smart mix thinking that we really need to use in a more informed and intelligent manner all the instruments, and nothing is excluded. It all depends on what works on the ground.
Thank you so much, Radu. It was really great to hear from you and learn from you today.
Yeah, thank you, Emily. Thanks everybody for listening.
And listeners, tell us what you think. You can find all the information mentioned in today's episode in the podcast description, and we want to hear from you. So leave us a comment. You can find us on SoundCloud, YouTube, Spotify, and well, across our social media as well. We would really value your feedback. Thank you very much for listening.